Well, greetings. Thank you all for coming out this morning to help us consider the questions, where are we going and how are we going to get there? My name is Paul Cashman. I am very pleased and honored to welcome you to City Council District 6. Equally pleased to welcome you to the University of Denver, one of our district's greatest assets. Thank you to DU for their willingness to host us on this brisk fall day. About 2 years ago, I was at an Urban Land Institute forum at Mary Reed Hall, just to the south across the Great Lawn. A group had assembled to discuss the University of Denver and its future. After the forum was over, a number of us went out to dinner, and I was seated across from one of the presenters, a bright, interesting woman from Indianapolis. And just to kick off conversation, I said to her, hey Jill, how's things in Indianapolis? And she thought for a minute, and she answered, there's something comforting about being a second-tier city. And that moment, that comment was the genesis for all of us getting together here this morning. Since 1982, when Federico Pena, as mayor at that time, urged us all to imagine a great city, any chat about Denver, how Denver was doing, seemed to be viewed through that lens in the context of where are we in comparison of some of the world's great places, be that New York, San Francisco, London, or Paris. And I think that conscious and many times unconscious drive to greatness has driven decision-making in Denver to this day. And I hearken back to Jill's comment of, and I wonder, is there a difference between being a great city and being a great place to live? Can they be one and the same? Does it take a different approach to be one rather than the other? And I do mean I wonder. I don't know. That's why I'm here today, and that's why I've asked all of you here today, hoping to get a bit more clarity on that question. About a year ago, my need to have this discussion was reinforced when I was pointed to a video that the city of Los Angeles had commissioned looking at what would be the maximum population of downtown LA. They started by looking at what their zoning permitted in terms of population. Then they looked at what could their water supply handle, and what could their power grid handle, the rest of their infrastructure. And I thought that's kind of the discussion I've been wanting to have in Denver, except while looking at those things, water and power and infrastructure is an important, maybe essential part of that conversation. What came to mind as perhaps even more important to me is what can we handle? What type of city do we want to be? For decades, Denver was 400, 450, 500,000 people. Today we're 700,000 people, probably a little more. Dr. Cog is predicting somewhere around 900,000 people by 2040. So again, what do we want to be? Do we really want to be a major metropolis like New York? Do we want to be 4 million people? Do we want to be 900,000 people? Is there even a way that we're able to decide those questions? Is it simply an inexorable upward glide path of continued growth? What type of place do we want to be? I wonder, and again, that's why I'm here, and that's why I've asked all of you to be here. So I hope you'll leave your pistols, your politics, and your predispositions in your pocket, and I hope you'll leave your mind open to new possibilities, new policies, and new priorities, no matter our individual agenda or differences. For today, We're all on the same team and seeking to get a shade closer to understanding where are we going and how do we get there. Right now, we thought, well, I said we're all on one team. We're aware that you might have some things on your mind, some weight on your chest that you need to get off. So I'm going to introduce Brian Corrigan, who's going to take the mic for a few minutes. Brian is a creative strategist in Denver who uses critical, creative, and conceptual skills to solve problems and issues in the new economy. I like to say that Brian's approach outside the box balances my approach nailed inside that box. So please buckle up. This is Brian Corrigan.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you guys for being here today. So first question, who here loves Denver? All right, everyone, come on. All right, that's good. Who has some concerns about maybe where Denver is going? All right, so we're going to take about 5 minutes here to just go ahead and to kind of share some of those concerns. So who would like to go first? Over there.
Hi, I'm Ann Callison. I used to be president of the George Washington neighborhood. The fort is full. The fort has been full for a long time. I basically think that beginning with Pena, who said, I imagine a great city, between he and Webb, and Hickenlooper and now Hancock, they have murdered the city. I used to tell people, I moved here in '84, I used to tell people in '85 this was the most manageable city on earth. My degree's in urban studies and I did some public affairs at Rice Airport. Big deal. But it's too big. This used to be a 15-minute town. It's now a 30 to 45-minute town. And I hope you all on the deck will agree that more people are leaving Denver than coming here. I'm not sure we want to retire here. It's just too much. It's too noisy. The roads are disgusting, both in physical form and in the time it takes to get there. And I call for at least a 48-month moratorium on everything until we get a grip on what we're going to do with the traffic and stop the highway.
Thank you so much for that. Who's next?
My name is Jim Stone. I've lived in southeast Denver for 42 years, and my vision of what's going wrong here, a little bit to this lady's point, but my vision is that there's by far too much high density development being allowed and too few spaces for people to park their cars when that development goes into place. Look no further than the corner of Colorado Boulevard and Evans, 350 units, and I think there's, and my numbers aren't correct, but it's like 190 car spaces or something like that. And this to me is ruining neighborhoods because you're not going to get all those cars anywhere near that building, but they're going to certainly proliferate into the neighborhood. So to cut it short, high density development.
Great, thank you. Who's next? Right here.
My name's Diane Thiel, and I am very concerned that we are leaving behind our poor and homeless people and making this a community of upper middle class and rich people. And we need to provide housing. We need to allow people in housing to stay in housing with climate change impacts about to just explode. We have to have people in housing, and I think we need to pay attention to that.
Thank you. Right here.
My name's Cindy Johnstone. I think we need to embrace the newcomers because they keep our city vibrant. And in doing that, I think we need to create healthy communities for the newcomers and figure out a way to really get them engaged and have a connection and a piece of the city.
Great, thank you so much. One more.
Jesse LaShawn Paris, next city council at large of Denver, Colorado. We need to address our gentrification rampant that's going on throughout this whole city on all sides, north, east, west, south. We're being displaced out of our neighborhoods, historically black and brown communities are being displaced. We do not feel at home here anymore. We feel like we are strangers in our own neighborhoods, if you will, and that needs to stop. So yes, I agree with the gentleman about the high density. That's exactly what's going on. And the city's been getting away with this linkage fee, but we have to address these metropolitan districts as well, because they have not been notifying the RNOs of their existence, and they're driving a lot of this development that we see. But the long and short of it is we're being left behind. Those that have built this city, that have built this whole country, we're being left behind, and we need to end that madness right now. So this is why I'm running for office. We got several other people running for office. Enough is enough of this madness. We have a homeless crisis. We have a displacement crisis. It's not affordable to live here anymore.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Paul, and we'll have more time later to discuss about these issues.
Thank you. I'm sure there are more concerns that we could express, but what we're doing here today, we're all aware that there are challenges we have to face. Today, hopefully, the discussion will center around how we move forward. I introduced Brian. I also wanted to introduce Lisa May, sitting over in the front. Lisa and Brian did all the heavy lifting in putting this together today, and I appreciate what they've done for I also want to take a minute to recognize a couple of folks from the city planning office who are with us today. Sarah Showalter is our citywide planning manager. Sarah, if you want to raise your hand, let folks know where you're at, there in the back. And also David Gasper is our principal city planner. Both Sarah and David had done their own share of heavy lifting over the past couple of years as important voices in the unfolding of the Denver Right planning process that has set our city some direction for moving forward in the coming decades. First up, to help open your thinkers a bit, is Susie Q. Smith. Susie is a poet of considerable renown. Of course, sure, let's give Susie a hand. For those who don't know my friend, Susie is a poet of considerable renown both here in Denver and around the country. Over the years, she has shared the stage with many noteworthy names, but as I read her biography this morning, the one name that leapt out at me was one of my longtime heroes, the late, great Gil Scott-Heron. So please welcome Susie Q. Smith.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. Good morning.
So I'm going to attempt to, I'll keep it brief, but I'm glad that we're starting with some art, because I think that's important to talk about. When we talk about these academic things, we talk about our ideas. I think it's important to also get into some creative thinking, and that's what I do a lot. So this is a poem called We Pay Cash for Houses. It's a contrapuntal poem, which is written in 2 columns, right? So you read one column down, another column down, and then you read the whole thing across. So I'm from Park Hill, by the way, so this is about Park Hill. Front yards with grass, old trees and shiny crab apples. Liquor stores here got bulletproof glass. The churches, tattered lighthouses, hold all our secrets. We lost Martin Luther King Boulevard. We hum our shame and moans. Old spirituals shape the bricks. Hand-me-down houses, delicious trees that gossip over fences. Popeye's chicken, church's chicken, laundromat check cashing payday loans. We who know each other's names and borrow cups of sugar, $20 until payday, just until we get on our feet. And did we not get on our feet? We made this, all of this, we made it. Fresh cut, clean as first day of school sneakers, even the mirrors finessed, new banks on the block, bundles of slow plunder, but the sidewalks ain't cracked no more. The alleyways smooth as untested promise of former corner store seedlings, blooming into downward facing dog, and parks that unwelcome children, bike lanes and boutique wine bars or family-friendly microbreweries, hear all the scents and sounds conspiring. Flooding to the teeth in whispered howls, drowning in hissed welcomes adrift the taunting memory of ground. Air made fat and wet with our breath for you, for you. Front yards with grass, fresh cut, old trees and shiny crab apples, clean as first day of school sneakers. Liquor stores here got bulletproof glass, even the mirrors finesse the churches, tattered lighthouses, but the sidewalks ain't cracked no more. Hold all our secrets, but the sidewalks ain't cracked no more. Sometimes it gets tricky reading the two colors. We lost Martin Luther King Boulevard, the alleyways smooth as untested promise. We hum our shame in moans of former corner store seedlings. Old spirituals shake the bricks, blooming into downward facing dog. Hand-me-down houses and parks that unwelcome children. Delicious trees that gossip over fences. Bike lanes and boutique wine bars. Popeye's chicken, Church's chicken, or family-friendly microbreweries. Laundromat check cashing payday loans. Hear all the scents and sounds conspiring. We, who know each other's names, hear all the scents and sounds conspiring. And borrowed cups of sugar flooding to the teeth in whispered howls. $20 until payday, drowning in hissed welcomes, just until we get on our feet, adrift the taunting memory of ground. And did we not get on our feet? Air made fat and wet with our breath. We made this, all of this for you. We made it for you. Academic and heavy, so I want to kick us into another short piece, and if you know it, feel free to join in. And this is something I wrote at a point when sometimes we feel like we're frustrated by change and don't have access to any power. I think that's where this piece was born from. So this is called Sleeping Giant. I am a sleeping giant. There lives a riot in my bones. I am a mouthful of sea. I am a quiet indigo dawn. If you have any rhythm, you can help me hold it. If you don't, that's okay. Nod along silently. That's cool. I don't judge you. Sometimes hope's the only space between your face and a hard rock, and prayer's the only major in the school of the hard knocks. Blisters on my feet from seeking walking for blocks, but I can tell the light from shadow, hear the truth when it talks. I'm so moved, I remove both of my shoes. I shake out the rocks and brace myself for the walk, and it's a long road, but my spirit is ready. I'm laying down my armor because it's gotten too heavy. I am a sleeping giant. There lives a riot in my bones. I am a mouthful of sea. I am a quiet indigo dawn. The only real constant in my life is me. I change pace and change lane, still in the driver's seat. Slay demons, smash walls when they're blocking me. Hiding weapons in the words while I'm looking for peace. I said my peace, I hold my peace. I seek the east for new horizons. I'm climbing, crying while and trying to find the highest. Dying to find the light beyond the brightest. I try to be that beacon you've been seeking. I'm dispelling all the shadows. The sun, the moon, the stars commune to show you where the light goes. How the wind blows and the earth turns and the river runs and the fire burns. And I'm still here. And I'm still now. Like lightning is urgent. And thunder is loud. This is the part where the giant wakes up, right? She says, these old winds stirring up the ground around me. Some said freedom must have come and found me. I've been breaking up what bound me around here so I can breathe. I am a sleeping giant. There lives a riot in my bones. Thank you.
Thank you, Susie Q. Not your normal planning forum thus far this morning. Thank you. So, I would not want to be the one to follow that, but first up, On my right, Professor Dr. Andy Getz. Andy is a professor here at DU, focusing his research and teaching on a variety of topics of relevance to today's discussion: transportation, transit-oriented development, land use, the economic impacts of all these areas, and more. He has published numerous articles and books, including his latest volume written along with another DU professor, Eric Boschman, entitled Metropolitan Denver, Growth and Change in the Mile High City. Please welcome Dr. Andrew Getz.
Okay, well, thank you so much for the invitation to be here in this forum. Very excited to be a part of this discussion this morning about where we are and where we're going here in Denver. It's a fascinating thing. I should just say something first about me, just in terms of my relationship with the city. I came here in the late 1980s from Ohio. I'm originally from Cleveland. And so in terms of what I study, cities and transportation, a lot of that is shaped by growing up actually in the city of Cleveland, which not very many people say they've done. And so having been here for the last 30 years or so, I sort of feel like a semi-native, not a true native, but you know, I've seen a lot of things that have been happening here in Denver over these last 30 years. So I'm very happy to be invited to talk about some of these issues. And what I'd like to do is, well, just first of all to say that we have a pretty large area, and depending upon which area you're talking about, there are going to be different population numbers, different statistics that apply. So I'm going to be presenting just a few general, very general numbers for both the metropolitan area of Denver, which includes all of these counties that are shown here on this map. The census has decided to include counties like Elbert, Park, Clear Creek, and Gilpin in metropolitan Denver, which if you go out to those places, they don't really look very metropolitan. But, you know, according to the way the census defines it, they've included those places. For the most part, though, we tend to talk about the kind of the 6-county region or 7-county region, because Broomfield is now a county, and then Boulder and Boulder County tend to get grouped in with a lot of things that are happening here in the Denver metropolitan area. But I'm going to be using the census designation for some of these things. The other jurisdiction that we're mostly focused on here, of course, is the city and county of Denver. And so I'll also be presenting some of the numbers for that very briefly, very, very briefly. Okay, so this is no surprise. Everyone here knows this. Denver is growing rapidly, and this is particularly true of the last 7 years. So this shows the census numbers for Denver's growth since 2010. So for the metropolitan area as a whole, we've gone from 2.5 million to just about 2.9 million for that area that I just showed there, which is just over 13% growth in that time. Denver City and County of Denver went from 600,000 to just over 700,000. So we've grown by 100,000 people in 7 years' time. And that's pretty rapid growth, 17.5% growth. And so this is what a lot of our focus is on. Another thing we don't have to really know or to see to understand, but the traffic congestion is certainly getting worse. These statistics come from the Texas Transportation Institute, which does their urban mobility report, and they're sort of the standard in terms of measuring congestion and how much delay there is per auto commuter in hours, and then what that would cost in terms of a per commuting cost. And you can see there the numbers associated with congestion here in metropolitan Denver. But I do want to put a more hopeful spin on this, and that's why I want to put this into some sort of context. Paul mentioned his conversation with someone from Indianapolis and saying it's good to be a second-tier city. Well, I think, at least in some regard, we can sort of thank our status in terms of being not the fastest growing city in the country. This shows metropolitan area population change for the top cities in the country, top metropolitan areas in the country since 2010. And look at those numbers. I mean, some of those are just absolutely staggering. Dallas, Fort Worth, and Houston both added almost 1 million people in 7 years' time to their metropolitan areas. That's just enormous growth. So when we think about, oh, this is really bad and we're having so many extra, look at these places. I mean, they're adding a lot of people. And those percentage increases are also pretty staggering and even higher than ours. You know, look at Dallas, look at Houston, look at Austin, adding 400,000 people. That represents 23% growth in 7 years. You know, that's just incredible. So when putting it into this context, we can see that, you know, we're not, you know, the worst in terms of having all that. I also wanted to put at the other end of the scale places like Cleveland and Pittsburgh and Youngstown. So these are at the bottom end of the metropolitan scale. They're losing people. Their entire metropolitan areas are losing people. And you know, they're facing a whole set of different issues to deal with. They would be happy to have some of these growth numbers. So it's a totally different story in places like that. If we're looking just at the cities themselves, the central cities, here too, Denver, we know, has been growing very rapidly, but so have these other places. New York has added almost 500,000 people in just the last 7 years. And so while the percentage increase is not so great because New York is so huge to begin with, that's still a lot of people that they're adding in a fairly short period of time. And then you see the other places there that are adding quite a few people in terms of percentage increases. On this list, only Austin and Seattle have higher percentage increases than Denver. So in terms of percentage increase, we are really experiencing quite a bit of growth, but we're not the only ones. There are other places out there that are also experiencing it too. And then on the bottom end of the scale, you see places like Toledo, Cleveland, and Detroit. Detroit lost 40,000 people just in the city of Detroit over the last 7 years, which continues a very long-term decline for the city of Detroit. The city of Detroit, at its height, used to have almost 2 million people in just the city itself, and now it's down to somewhere around 600,000 or so. So they've lost like 2/3 of their population in about 50 or 60 years. So, I mean, that's just incredible to see what's going on in places like that. So it's always important to put this into some kind of context. And even with regards to traffic congestion, we're not the worst. Look at the #1 city here for traffic congestion. We've got Washington, D.C., that has 82 hours of delay per auto commuter per year with the accompanying cost associated with that congestion. It's interesting to see that recently Amazon has announced that their HQ2 is going to be in Crystal City, Virginia, which is part of the Washington, D.C. area. I don't think they were looking at these statistics when they decided that. I mean, if it's bad now, consider how much worse it's going to be once Amazon goes in there. And then their other HQ2 they're looking at is somewhere in the New York City region. And they have their share of growth there as well. So I don't know what statistics Amazon's looking at, but I don't think they're looking at these. Just the last few things I want to show here, since I'm a geographer, I love maps, and so I wanted to show a couple of maps. These come from the Piton Foundation that does a lot of really good work in terms of studying Denver and what's happening in neighborhoods. And so this is from 2000 to 2010, so it's not the most recent period, but it does show sort of the trajectory of growth, the geography of growth in the Denver metro area, and which places have seen more increases and which places are decreasing in population overall. So you kind of get a sense of where things are going in terms of where the growth is going. And you can tell that a lot of it is still going to outer areas, but also very strong growth in central Denver, indicated by those red areas right in the center. And then zeroing in on Denver itself, this shows the neighborhoods that have had most of the population increases during that decade, and then those neighborhoods that have seen declines in terms of population. And so areas out in northeast Denver, Stapleton, Montbello, Green Valley Ranch, have been growing quite a bit during that decade. And this is all related to the decision to build Denver International Airport and the opportunity that Denver had to annex that land and then to redevelop Stapleton as a neighborhood and these other areas that previously weren't a part of Denver. It's the only time since the Poundstone Amendment was enacted in the 70s that Denver has been able to annex any territory. And so what that really means, in a sense, is that a lot of this growth that we're having right now in the city of Denver can be tied to that annexation. But there's a limit, right? I don't think Denver's going to be annexing too much more land going out. So there is a limit to how much we're going to be growing in terms of population. So some of this is related to that expansion, but whether we're going to continue to grow the same rate like we have been, probably not, because what it would mean is that we would be increasing our density a lot more, and there are limits to that as well. So with that, I think I'll stop and turn it over to the group.
If there are 2 or 3 questions we can take. Andy, if you want to call in.
Sure, go ahead.
Hi. I was just noting that that last slide you showed is almost 10 years old.
Yeah, I know.
The data's pretty old on that.
I asked Piton for updates, and they didn't have any, so I'm anxiously looking for the most recent.
You don't have any sense of a different trend anywhere, do you? Just from other information that you have?
For me, I would say that I think that it's still going in that same direction. Central Denver, those areas that were growing, I think those have still been growing, but I really don't know more than that. And so maybe others here would know more about that.
You talked about the regions that are growing, increasing their density, but you didn't, and the mechanisms, but you didn't talk about the mechanisms for the areas that are decreasing their density.
Yeah.
I was surprised to see the island neighborhood as decreasing in their density.
Yeah, well, the Highland neighborhood is one that's undergoing a lot of gentrification, and with that, the density's actually gone down. That the density previously had been higher, and so there is a displacement effect. People are moving out, and so even though a lot of other people are moving in, overall population is actually lower.
So it must mean they have fewer members of household per household.
That's part of it. Also, the dwellings. Yeah, I would just say, yeah, the overall number of people per dwelling unit is going
The
down.
number of dwelling units is going up with multiple story buildings.
Yeah, well, there's that too, but overall, it's gone, the density's gone down. Yes?
So if you, on your map, if you were to eliminate or look at the population, what was traditionally Denver before the expansion associated with DIA,
Yeah.
do you know what the population is of that area to compare with prior numbers?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know offhand what that would be, but it would be considerably less.
Let's take one more.
Okay, go ahead.
I really like this because it looks at broader than just Denver. I think so much of the decision-making that we do here in our city sort of acts as if what happens in Aurora or in the places right around us isn't going to impact us. And I'd love to see more of a conversation about how we work with other communities in the area to think about, you know, jobs, housing, not just transportation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you very much. We'll have time later in the morning to ask all of our presenters additional questions. You all noticed the lovely spinners on your table. I'm going to call Brian back up and have him explain what they're about and the next phase of what we're doing here.
So I like to have a little fun, and that's what hopefully these tables will facilitate, but also facilitate some really good ideas on really what will Denver be tomorrow. So could I please have our table leaders just raise their hands? All right, so it looks like we almost Eileen, if you want to come up here. So our table leaders are going to help facilitate these discussions. But pretty much the topic is Denver tomorrow. And what we're going to do is when I say spin, you're going to spin the spinners. And whatever lens that the spinner lands on, that is going to be how you'll frame the discussion. So if the spinner lands on utopia, then we're going to go ahead and talk about Denver tomorrow as the utopian. Or if it lands on dystopia, we'll talk about it through that particular lens. So this is a fun way to go ahead and just to get our ideas flowing, and then also to meet new people and to really share your ideas with your neighbors. So let's go ahead and spin the spinners, please.
Sure. I've got a lot of material.
All right, does everyone have their plans? All right, okay, 10 minutes, let's go.
Hello, everyone. I was checking. I'm just here as a I've done this before, but I really think what we need to do is define it relates to
On any type of development, do we think about
what do we feel is the definition of
on Denver?
Yes. I think that's what it is that we're supposed to decide that ourselves, right?
You know, it's very interesting.
Everybody space to talk. If somebody has already spoken, that we make sure we give everybody some time and space to have the floor at some point. So sustainability in Denver, as we think about sustainability and how it manifests in our day-to-day, what are some of your thoughts on how Denver's growing and how we can sustain it? And there's many different ways that we could look at sustainability from various resources. So if there's anyone who just wants to jump in on their initial thoughts.
Yes, we can start by changing the building code about what constitutes a household in the city and county of Denver and how many unrelated people can live in a dwelling.
There's also simple things like trash recycling comes out of the taxes, the compost you have to go through the effort to pay for. Like that's a little one, you know, you can flip that around. I think also education around it in DPS, like how kids relate to consumption. That's something we can get people started on earlier. Kids can come home and talk about it in their household. Because these little flyers that they leave on the trash cans aren't going to help anybody. If you have really engaged teachers that are trying to build lifelong habits in the classroom, I think that's a better play for us than flyers.
So you've seen a lot since '65.
Mike, I'll tell you what bothers me on this impact.
Yes.
Is I drive up Lawrence Street. Just looks like we're building the slums of the future.
Yeah. You mean the big, tall buildings?
Well, the residential buildings.
Yes.
Not
Okay.
And they're pretty ugly.
They're ugly. They're
Really, they're
ugly.
ugly.
There's no grass.
Yes.
No grass involved. The finish of them is not conducive to long-term looking nice. I just think we built the slums of the future.
Yeah.
And that's really going to come. I mean, I've seen the slums of the future in Chicago and in Pittsburgh where I lived for a year.
Oh, Pittsburgh. They've done it a little differently.
Pittsburgh's actually a dynamically powerful city, even
But
they,
losing.
yeah, I saw that. I was a little surprised, but they lost all the steel.
And I don't see that changing.
Well, and furthermore, if I'm not mistaken, the city allows waivers for developers to seek fewer than the, whatever the requirement is, and they get approved all the time, to your point perhaps. I shouldn't say all the time, I don't know that for a fact, but I know in our neighborhood here, I live 2 blocks from DU on the east side, and it's like a canyon here now with all the developments up and down the street here. It's just, it's immense. And so I would support some kind of examination of the policy with respect to density. I know that the codes that, I can't remember the name of the movement that led to them, but they encourage density along the high traffic routes. So I have the blessing or curse of living near Evans and University, where there's skyscrapers around me all over the place, and I think it's probably right in keeping with the policy that was established, because that's what they wanted to see. But what are the limits to that? And that's what drew me to this meeting. Where are the reasonable limits of even a good policy?
So policy doesn't necessarily need to be law. It can just be like a way of doing things, or code, or
I think we're
something more
For
casual.
the purposes of this conversation, I'm not sure the distinction between law and policy.
The problems that come along with this are higher traffic problems and just higher density and all that.
And that goes back to having better planning.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
instead of just one, you know, the administration of whatever city administration we have.
And I agree that having a city where people want to live is good. It's managing the growth and how to do that.
And also treasuring those past. I live in the house conservation and historical designation. And I'm thinking of all of the historical buildings along 16th Street that were destroyed for some reason. And I think there's some things of the past that we need to preserve in some neighborhoods. Pilar lives in Bonnie Bray. It's a charming community with little bungalows. I don't know how to address it. I mean, we have.
I live in Wash Park too, and we took a bungalow. We kept the bungalow and just renovated the inside, but everybody else in the neighborhood just. But then I lived in
the infrastructure with the transit parking
without spilling over into the existing neighborhood.
Exactly, and so there's a lot of tension there, and there's also and related to that is the tension of the affordable housing, right? Because there's been, I wouldn't say I'm in favor of density. I'm in favor of building sustainable and more efficient housing. But the problem is that there's been so much rampant development in my mind. And by the way, I lived in Atlanta for 16 years, where all this has been gangbusters for about 5-10 years now. But in my mind, a lot of the issues that I have with dense housing is that it's still luxury housing in most cases.
Yeah.
It's not affordable, and that creates issues on its own. So we've got this dystopia with housing and density, and that kind of spills into transit as well.
Yeah.
Right? Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
Well, it's the wealthy and powerful, well-connected people that are making all the decisions for everybody else. And, you know, their decisions are driven by their own prosperity, not what's good for the community.
Well, and this is another interesting conflict that I've only been here 3 years, but the woman who kind of kicked off the meeting with the 4-year moratorium on everything, interesting solution. But more to the point, she raises, like I said, I'm here 3 years, everyone's been here for far longer than that. And I haven't been here that long, and I am not happy with how the city is changing for the natives from here. You know, I don't think that's fair to people who've been here forever, who have grown up with this place basically, and now are seeing it grow and become something totally different. So that's another interesting dystopia, isn't it? When a city evolves and changes, sometimes in a really fascinating way it becomes exciting and vibrant, but also like what do we do with the people who have been here forever and really liked that kind of second tier city that's a bit quieter, a little bit calmer. How do we resolve that?
Let me ask you a question.
For 30 years, so you've seen it.
Yeah.
On the Kendro project, have you attended meetings? What have you thought of their collaboration and involvement with the community. I grew up in Southeast Denver, on Fairfax and Florida approximately, and I've attended meetings. I live in District 4, but I want to see what's happening. What has been your take on their involvement?
I think that
Good, bad, or in?
they started out.
Barn by the time
does allow for a few multiple family buildings. Multiple unit of 2 units instead of 1. So it's moving in the right direction a little bit. But even that, the West Washington Park Neighborhood Association heard about that and sent a newsletter out rousing their members to fight against it.
What's on your mind?
Well, I'm big into walking, biking, etc. And of course, that's a great way to get to know your neighbors. You walk around, you see people on the porch. Hey, how you doing? People walking the dogs. Hey, how you doing? The sidewalks, of course, in a lot of these neighborhoods are just really not in good shape. Some of these side streets don't have sidewalks at all. I saw an old woman just barely getting by on a street, just she's walking in the gutter, and I stopped. I said, "Can I give you a ride?" Even though it's 2 blocks. To get her onto a sidewalk. She didn't take me up on my offer, but nonetheless, to make it a really walking neighborhood friendly and bike neighborhood friendly, we all know about the bike trails. Let's talk about the sidewalks.
Right.
So you can take your baby for a stroll. You can go for a walk without someone being in the street or on someone's lawn. So that's something I would just love to have. Is I think when the suburbs kept building out, they had different zoning, didn't they, where you didn't have to have a sidewalk. So we go for walks in the suburbs. You're all out in the middle of the street. So try to do that in the wintertime. We want to go for a walk in the wintertime. We can do that in Colorado.
All right, everybody.
Is someone going to slide into you?
That's right.
I mean, so that's one thing that I want to add to the discussion.
And then there's all the scooters, the new electric scooters going on the sidewalks too.
All right, it looks like there's some good conversations happening out there. All right, so what we're going to do next is we have about 15 minutes just to do very brief kind of summaries of what people discussed. So the brief summary is 3 sentences. So please, if you can go ahead and kind of tell us what you talked about in 3 sentences, that would be awesome. So who wants to take the first stab at it? All right.
All right, our table landed on Utopia, so the Denver Tomorrow for Utopia. We think that support for neighborhoods is like a critical kind of component, not on a one-size-fits-all, but neighborhood by neighborhood, a toolbox that each neighborhood can have and claim as their own to get the situation the way that they want. No more hungry kids. The environment is critical for the future Utopia. Transportation, basically mobility for all, not just cars, but a robust transit system. And then schools that are strong and powerful.
And housing.
And housing for all, yep.
Awesome. Well, thank you. All right, who wants to take the next one? Right over here.
We landed on dystopia, so I thought that'd be a nice contrast. Started talking about the fear of robot wars. Just kidding. That was a joke. Just kidding. So we did have some real fears about running out of water or any kind of scarce resources. There was talk about some things that have been done, but may not be enough policy-wise. The need for better transportation, in particular from east to west, whether that's extending the light rail, and there was talk about resistance of people with citizens with raising taxes, but that might need to for that transportation, and about that density isn't always a bad thing, but that it needs to be planned. So with the developers being required, for example, building a high-rise, but making sure to have underground parking and enough spaces so that you're adding people, but you're adding access as well. So.
Great, thank you. All right. Catherine, and please speak up too.
Yep.
Yes.
So ours landed on policy, and we talked a lot about kind of awareness and education so that people understand what policy is, how it's set. making sure that we as a community think about, are we setting policy based on our vision or evidence-based decision making? And then really thinking about getting people involved in shaping not only the plans, but the policies that make the plans, and getting people involved in more creative settings at an earlier stage.
Great, thank you. All right, who's next? All right.
We landed on Utopia as well, and I think our focus was more about scale and keeping communities together. We talked a lot about sidewalks, walking. We talked about density from a city planning scale, but more about neighborhoods, what a great neighborhood is about. So good stuff.
Great, thank you. All right, over here.
We talked about policy as well, or that's where we landed, and we questioned that, are there value-driven policy decision-making processes? So are our values proceeding, such as related to safety? If we have no parking in front of our houses, for women in particular, it's a safety issue to walk to your residence at night, and older people as well. We also talked about knowing first how we can support new units that we're building relative to pollution or water, and that we look at controlling growth, but not necessarily the moratorium idea. And then the last is that it's important to pay attention to your elected officials so that you can share your values with them to make sure it drives their decision making.
Great, thank you. All right.
Were you pointing at me?
Yeah.
So we landed on dystopia. This was like fish in a barrel. A lot of our conversations were kind of about the dynamic tension and conflicts that have already been coming up a lot, obviously. So for example, there was density and housing. How do we solve that problem if the housing is too expensive and does not have enough infrastructure, transit, and parking to complement that? We talked about the conflict of Denver kind of quickly moving into being a smaller, quieter city, kind of second tier, into this massively exploding and growing city, which can be amazing and bring a lot of vibrance and excitement and high energy, but also kind of ruin it for some of the people who have been here for decades, perhaps. Another thing that comes with the density and the population explosion and this need for really efficient building is beauty. You know, we started the this whole talk with beautiful poetry and music, and then we have the slot housing going up that looks like, you know, Soviet bloc housing because there's nothing on it and there's a lot of concrete happening. So how do we make sure that our city is still beautiful and keep so many of its classic aesthetics that are so unique to Denver and still be able to build new modern housing?
Great, thank you. That was beautiful. Good job. Eileen?
Okay. First of all, I'm very impressed everyone at my table took notes, except me, because I'm a talker. But we landed on impact, and right away what came up is how out of control the growth and how it's impacting everyone. A lot of discussion about building the slums of the future, in the sense of that the buildings that are going up are just not very pretty, not very community oriented, concerned about how long they'll last and whether they're really creating community or just creating little boxes for people to live in. And of course the lack of green space. Nobody is, you know, we don't have an Olmsted going, this piece of land is going to stay green. And it's a big discussion about developers versus everyday folks who want to keep their community vibrant and warm, and so there was a discussion about how important zoning is, in the sense of Elitch came up that there's fear that that is going to disappear because the developer is probably, as everything is, every square foot of land now in Denver is becoming more and more valuable, and how important zoning is to the fact that what someone can do with that land. A big discussion about losing your vista. and your view of the beauty that you are here for, or that you have always loved and been a part of. I had that happen in New York, where they just build a building right in front of you, and a number of people at the table have had that experience, and how disturbing that is to their lifestyle and their love of this community. And then last but not least, we did jump to sustainability in saying that that's a really a big part of impact, in that we really need to think about this growth in terms of the sustainability, of course, you know, our air, our water, et cetera. We all know about the water. And that was something I think we're going to jump into maybe later. but we started on sustainability after impact.
Great. Ethel?
We landed on Utopia. We spent a lot of time talking about transportation and parking. And I think our utopic answers were to slow the pace of growth, however, and mass transit, a good mass transit system. And I think the how we kind of landed on maybe is to be proactive. And they kind of mentioned it with policy, paying attention to what your representatives are doing so you can be on the proactive end. Right now, a lot of us are reactive, and using the democratic system. And did I miss anything? All right.
So we landed on sustainability, and we talked about youth and education, and how, when we're thinking about sustaining our city, how we actually need to bring in the youth into our conversation. That sometimes, for example, with recycling, it would be much more impactful to be talking about this in our schools and having our kids bring it back to our homes than putting a flyer on a trash can outside. We also talked about housing codes and the fact that right now, if you're not related, you can't have more than 5 people in a house. And then as we're thinking about high density growth within Denver, we need to be thinking about those codes and who that discriminates against. And then we also talked about this idea of the oppressor and who's being oppressed, and the income disparity within Denver, and that actually we had a great, beautiful metaphor of it being a boat, and that Denver looks really beautiful on the top, but underneath there's some holes in the boat. And if we don't start thinking about how we proactively work to patch those holes and just react to it, Denver's not going to be able to sustain itself. So that pretty much, yeah.
Great.
Good job. Thank you. All right, we have time for about one more.
Okay. We've got sustainability also, and we really focused a lot on transportation in our conversation, but we also talked a lot about the rampant development and how decisions are being made for planning, and how it's been a long row of what we felt were not the best decisions for Denver, and how do we change that? We didn't come up with that answer. We talked about roads not being accessible for everybody, the construction making things difficult. We talked a lot about scooters and using scooters, and you know, we had some differing opinions on whether they were good or bad, but that we really felt that we needed to you know, use those new things that were coming into the area. She didn't agree. And we also talked about how difficult it is for young people who live in Denver right now to not to live on their own and to even have a place on their own. So there's difficulty, a lot of difficulty with sustainability right now, and we've had no answers.
Good. All right, I was just joking. We have time for one more. Over here. Okay.
Okay, I think most of my table mates have left for snacks, but that's okay. So some common themes to what we've heard so far. Our table spun the wheel and landed at policy. So you heard a little bit earlier, there was an idea at our table about a moratorium on development to get our arms around things. There was also, piggybacking on a comment I heard earlier, an interest in recognizing and appreciating why people live here, why they moved here, maintaining some views and vistas. So that was a common theme. Also an idea to support more ADU or accessible dwelling unit construction and allowance throughout the city. to allow for more people to stay in the city, and also some excitement about the growth and how can that happen more smartly, and that's the policy that we need.
Go for it, yeah.
All right, thanks, Brian. Yeah, we didn't get as much breadth as some of the other groups, but we landed on Utopia and started talking about access and equality. And in our Utopia, a car is a very expensive way to get around our city, so kind of opening up the access and whether it's, I don't think there was a lot of love for skateboards, but including everyone else in the group, I think, how, whether you're 8 or 80, how do you get around our city and kind of happiness in our city as well.
Great. So do we get everyone then? Wow. No? Okay, yes.
Everything's been covered that we said, so very similar stuff.
Okay. Well, I am so impressed that you guys did such great 3-sentence summaries. That is awesome. All right, so turn it back over to Paul.
Well, thank you all for that. And I thought it's really interesting. We are an extremely diverse city in so many ways. We have my friend Spencer over here as a major scooter advocate, okay? And I know we have folks in the room who disagree with that. And it's not just the age that you are today, but as we age, I had the opportunity to have lunch with our former mayor, Wellington Webb, a few weeks ago. And during his term, he certainly participated in Denver's growth. The airport and the Platte Valley, and so a lot of the building began or continued through his administration. But he told me he had lunch with Mayor Hancock recently. And what he told him was that, when you get to be this age, I think Mayor Webb is in his mid-70s right now, so when you get to be this age, you learn to see what's really important to you. And he said, you can keep developing, but I don't want to live in a city where I don't have a view of the mountains, And as very few of us actually have mountain views from our homes, but as we travel around Denver, you get those glimpses, and it's very comforting. It is to me. It's a wonderful part of living in Denver. And so I understand growth. I believe growth will continue in some way, but I do hope that we never become a city where you need to go to Golden to see your mountains. So just wanted to throw that in. If you're going to applaud, you need to stand up and really get after it. So thank you for that. Down there, young fella. Okay, next up, Jeff Romine is one of Denver's true stealth assets. As our city's chief economist, Mr. Romine's work plays a critical role in all manner of economic, financing, and development programs and strategies, and he currently serves as director of the Office of Economic Development's Neighborhood Equity Division, working to address involuntary displacement in Denver, as well as helping attract, retain, and expand companies in the Mile High City. Now, as an aside, this is a man with his priorities in order. When I asked Jeff if he could speak to us today, he said that he would love to. However, his son plays soccer for Colorado Academy, and they have a good team, and if they had made it to the state championships, that game would be today, and he would be at the game. Unfortunately and fortunately, his son's team made it to the quarterfinals, and their season ended there, so I'm glad to have Jeff Romine with us. Please welcome Jeff Romine.
Thank you, Councilman, and thank you all for having me here. Most people don't invite economists, especially on a Saturday morning, to want to talk about what's going on. So my role within the city is, as the Councilman pointed out, I've served in many different roles within the city and worked on a number of things, ranging anywhere from housing to other things. The other part of what I do is oftentimes in the articulator of what's changing and what's happening within the community, both from an economic standpoint, as well as some of the demographic and other changes. as pointed out earlier, some of the information that was provided around what's going on specifically within some neighborhoods was up to 2010. Some things have changed, and you can feel them and you can see them. So I would invite you, if you want to follow up a little bit more on what Andy talked about, you can go to 2 places to get a little more data of what's going on with the demographic and changes that are occurring within our neighborhoods by just going to either the community Denver's CPD department, and that's where Sarah and David work. And if you go into that, you can go into Blueprint Denver, or you can go into Denver Right, which is the 4 plans that are being worked on right now, drop into Denver, or into Blueprint Denver, and then drop into Community Profiles. From there, you should be able to get to some updated information and be able to look at the neighborhoods a little bit more closely. The other place to go is, as Andy pointed out, was the P-Town Foundation. They spun that group into something called Shift Research Labs. And so you can go to Shift Research Lab and you'll see community profiles on every neighborhood within the city. And it'll talk about the changes that have occurred over the last 7 years. They utilize the same data that Andy does, which is the census data and some other things. So if you want to see what's going on now, the reason why I raised that, as somebody pointed out and asked about what I still call Powder Highland, which most people will now refer to as Low-High. That area has changed significantly, and you've seen a lot of construction going on. But one of the things that I just want to talk about from the standpoint of some of the work that I've done in the past at a regional level as well as at the city level is population change. When you use that metric, of course, is 2 different things going on. One is increased housing units and the people that live in them, and some people have talked about that. The other is the existing housing units that exist in Denver. And if you look around this neighborhood and other neighborhoods around here, I live in West Highlands and I've looked around that, what you see is a changing composition within the households. There used to be families with 4 people, 2 kids, 2 adults, or 3 kids or whatever. The children oftentimes, I hope my children do this, move away, go to college, and then move away. I do have a basement. It's very small. It's not accessible, so no one can live down there upon graduation. So what you see, what some of the things you're seeing within our neighborhoods is also repopulation. Somebody in one of the comments they talked about, you know, we want to embrace the new neighbors because they bring some experiences and they bring some vitality to our community and new experiences, and that's wonderful. Well, those new neighbors oftentimes are replacing a former neighbor who we loved and cherished. They moved on in their own life, in their own life cycle, and somebody came in and new kids came in with that family. So oftentimes you see a population change that occurs because of revitalization of that house, just like revitalization of our neighborhoods. So I just wanted to mention that. This is what I'm really here to talk about. What the councilman asked me to talk about was to set the frame of what's going on with the economy today. I'm not going to bore you. You will see some slides that have the things that economists do. I'm going to flip through those really fast. I have a few words, and these are the 3 things that we're facing from an economic perspective right now. Both the sunshine, what I call the strengths, and think about those, and that's those things that you all know about and you read in the papers all the time. As you move across, you can see the foundational parts that make Denver, and equally important, Denver metro area so strong. One of the strongest 15 to 20 metropolitan areas in the country, as pointed out again and again by Andy's points. Finally, here's the, you know, I'm a mountaineer at times, and so when you're up there, and you all know this, at 2 o'clock, if you start seeing clouds coming on the horizon, you get off those mountains. We all know that, and these are the clouds that are of concern to me. And I'm not alone in these clouds. Now, have they come in and are we seeing the lightning storms coming in at the mountaintops? Not yet, but these are the issues. And I'm going to talk about those a little bit more detail. There's a few numbers. You can see these later if you want. The councilman has this PowerPoint, and so if you reach out to him, I'm sure he's happy to share it. The economy is still doing well. The unemployment rate's down to 3.7. More importantly, locally, the unemployment is running around 3%. Reference point, at the peak, we were at 8.2% unemployment. We had almost 28,000 of our fellow residents in Denver who were unemployed in 2009. Now we have about 12,000. That's the structural unemployment. Those are people switching jobs. The reason why I raise that is we're in the best of times, and I really do mean that. And that is not yes, it is. It's a reference to Charles Dickens, and yes, I'm not Dickens, but I'm here and speaking at a university. I should use some references. There's your graph. Shows you that the employment is all the way up. The green is this is the highest we've ever had for employed people working in city and county of Denver. When Mayor Hickenlooper came in, we had lost 25,000 jobs from before, so that was our new bottom. We've since obviously grown quite a bit since that period of time. However, it's beginning to slow down. What this chart shows you very briefly is the last 3 years. Yellow was 2 years ago, or actually almost 3 now, we're almost through 18. Economic data tends to lag. The green is what we experienced in 16, and look at blue in 17. So we are seeing a slowing in our economy naturally anyway. There's the sales tax. This is a good news story. I oftentimes tell people when Mayor Hickenlooper was in office, he had 1 year of positive budget, 7 years of budget cuts. Mayor Hancock has enjoyed, and this city council's enjoyed 8 years of positive budget. Each year grows and grows and grows, which has allowed the city and allowed the council to make choices that were beyond what we normally have done. Some new things. I think sidewalks was one of the initiatives over the last year and a half. More dollars are going into those types of things, and that's where that partially comes from. Here's the one that I think always, it's an interesting one because the blue is what's called natural increase. And this is for us. But this is the natural increase. That means how many kids are being born versus how many deaths. That's what natural increase means. So the red is the new people coming to Denver. Okay? So that's the thing that oftentimes people talk about. It's the new license plates we see on the roads. It's all those types of people. Here's the population distribution just to give you some sense. And this is relatively typical to what the distribution has looked like. Not the numbers, but the shares. But these are by the generations, and you can see the baby boomers in purple, Gen X is in green, and you can see who we're really attracting and what those people are doing. And again, all of these slides are available. You can reach out to me or the councilman's office, and they have this PowerPoint. This is the one that I wanted to get to because it talks about a couple of things that Andy talked about. I think it's some things that I'm kind of probably leading a little bit into what Rocky's going to talk about today. The key here is this is housing demand, otherwise known as new houses. Those are the people in purple and blue. Now, what you'll notice is, and I'm going to kind of walk over here, is the new households are the blue ones, and you can see as we're going through the early parts of the previous decade, you can see what happened is very limited household formation and supply. So what we began to see was an oversupply of the housing market at that period of time. It slowed down because we went into the housing shock a little bit faster than anybody else around the country, which is why it wasn't quite as severe here as, like, say, LA or Las Vegas or Phoenix. But now look what's happened since. The blue line is above, and so we've had household formation growing ever since, and supply is not meeting it. That's part of the reason why we have this. So here's housing production. Purple is multifamily, blue is single family. And what you can see is during this period, starting in 6, all the way through, we are not meeting the regional housing demands. This is the average housing demand up there in a period. So what that means is we have a housing shortage. It's primarily because of production. And you can see purple is the multifamily are rising up. But that's what's happening, and there's a cautionary note in this, as I presented this same slides to the mayor about a month and a half ago. And that is and I think it was raised here, you can find an apartment in Denver, absolutely no problem. You might not be able to find an affordable housing apartment. That's difficult to find, and I will give you that, and we're doing what we can and doing as much as we can. In fact, the city council approved additional $15 million annually for the next 20 years for helping support affordable housing. But what's happened is housing prices continue to rise. What we're not building is single-family housing in Denver. Now, many people, when you hear single-family housing, what you're thinking of is the separated single-family home that you see with a lot and the driveway and all of that. We're also talking about what I would call multifamily, but individually owned, otherwise known as condos. And that we don't create. So here's a few slides for you. There's Case-Shiller. What this is as Andy was pointing, he pointed to some other areas and talked about it. In this particular side, we are green. I always use green for Denver. And you can see where the housing appreciation has gone. This is the U.S. So we're staying right along with the U.S. as a major area. In fact, we were slower in this period of time. Here are some of our, these are all of our competing cities that we oftentimes are put up against. And as you can see, most of them are significantly higher as far as housing appreciation. So like some of the slides that Andy was pointing out, what that means is yes, we have problems here. Yes, we have issues that we have to address collectively and together. But the reality is it's worse in other places. It doesn't mean that we don't, I'm not trying to apologize or suggest that they're not real issues. They are. What I'm suggesting, though, is wow, sure glad I'm not in San Francisco right now. And so that's what's going on. I just got to do a few now. Here you go. This is me proving I'm an economist. Here's the GDP change. You can see what's happening. It's become pretty stable. Here's consumer sentiment. And consumer sentiment, most people know what that means. That's telling us what we think is going to be happening at the national level. Look at one of these things, and I'm foreshadowing something right here. Look at consumer sentiment here. Look at it here. It's kind of staying along where it was, kind of growing up. Look where we are here. And by the way, if you haven't figured it out, these gray bars, recessions. What I'm telling you is the consumers aren't very good at predicting when a recession is coming. So if you think I'm bad at guessing, and my colleagues as economists can't tell you when it's going to happen, nor can anybody else, individuals. But there are a few things that people tend to look at. Many people who've been reading about economics recognize that there's something called the 10-year versus the 2-year yield. This has indicated the last, I don't know if it's like 10 recessions. And I'm not telling you there are recessions coming. That's not why I'm here. But when it gets close to 0, we have a recession historically or an economic slowdown usually within 6 to 9 months. I'm not telling you it's coming. Now, those of you who are older tend to know what debt means and tend to know you want to handle your debt well. This is the U.S. We collectively, look what's happened to our debt. And again, those recession bars are sitting there, and you can see how it kind of goes. There's several ways you can handle debt. Obviously, you can increase taxes, you can lower spending, you can also create superinflation, because then every dollar that's in debt becomes deminimized, and it solves your problem kind of in a weird way. It does have lots of harm, and so I'm not suggesting we should go into hyperinflation. But what I'm suggesting to you is there's a number of clouds on the horizon. But if you remember that first slide, all the way back to the first slide, I talked about what's good, the sunshine, what's foundational, and what's troubling. And when you really think about that, and then you look at our peer cities, and you look at the nation as a whole, what I believe, and this is me personally as an economist, what I truly believe is there's going to be there is a slowing, it's already starting, there's going to be continuing slowing, but what I'm really telling you is foundationally we're in excellent shape from the economy. We're in excellent shape in part because we do some things in this region and in this city that are a little bit different than other places. First place is we tend to be what's called counter-cyclical. What that means is we built an airport that is a 50-year or 100-year investment that really put us in a new place. We built it in the recession. Maybe luck, maybe planning, I don't know. But what that meant is we built it with cheaper, we got cheaper construction costs, we got labor, we bonded it, we did the right things, and what we ended up with was an asset. And if anybody that runs a business, you know sometimes it's good to invest in your business because you create an opportunity. Effectively, what this region has historically done is that type of activity. We built a light rail system. Primarily in the last recession. We built the airport in the recession before that. We do that tends to be that we know how to invest in tomorrow, we pay for it ourselves, and we move forward. And so what I'm telling you is while I do think there's some slowing that's coming in the economy at the national level, I don't think it's going to impact us quite the same way, but it will kind of soften some of the pressure that we're under. And more importantly, what we're doing here and what we're doing in the region historically has been something to also make sure that we kind of weather those slowdowns a little bit stronger. And then what it puts us is in a place where we're investing in tomorrow. So meetings like this, conversations like this, are critically important because what they do is they help our leaders understand and make choices that say, how do we invest in tomorrow? And so if you notice when the opening slide, I guess that line wasn't up there. The opening slide is I took literally from the question here, which is where are we going, and where, was the question. Since there was no, it wasn't a complete statement when I got it, when I was asked to speak here, I didn't know if the councilman amended is where are we going question mark, or where are we going exclamation mark. So I put them both in, because I think that's part of what this conversation is about, is where are we going, and where can we go collectively? And I think those are the things that we're answering. What I'm telling you is I think we're in a strong economic foundation. However, I do think there's some slowing that's coming that will, in fact, give us some time to breathe and for us to make some choices about what we're going to do for the next 10 to 20 years. At that, I appreciate it. I'm happy to take any final questions that people have for me today.
Can you go back to your slide that had rental housing on it?
Yeah.
Because I really think what happened there, early 2000s, we had some really crap builders in this region. And so we ended up with the construction defects legislation. That's why we don't have any more condos.
Right. You're absolutely, well, I can't speak to the first part of your statement, but I can speak to the second. And that is yes, there's a construction defects issue. In talking to developers, because again, as I mentioned, I work, some of my assignments over the last 10 years have been working on leading the housing programs for Denver. And I luckily did it, well, I shouldn't say luckily, I did it during the recession. But I do understand construction defects. There are some that report that construction defects adds anywhere from $50,000 to $100,000 per condo. So what you end up seeing is there are condos being constructed here in Denver. They tend to price in at about $700,000 or above. And I don't know about you, but when I got out of college, my first home wasn't at relatively $700,000. It was a small bungalow that I finally bought 10 years after grad school. So the point is that tends to be in an urban market, especially a city market, that tends to be the first home somebody can buy is a condo, and you're not doing it at $700,000.
I think that also goes to building inspection. And the cities and the counties in some way brought the construction defect legislation upon themselves because they would not call out the bad construction that was going on. And so if the city wants condos to come back, we need to grow a spine and say, no, you can't cut those corners.
Yes, ma'am.
So I'm old enough that I remember when the GDP did not used to include energy costs because they had blown out of the water. Are there any statistics that takes health care or medical care out of the GDP?
So I think actually what you're referencing is the Consumer Price Index. And the Consumer Price Index as opposed to the GDP. The GDP is, of course, the accounting of all goods and services produced in the country. And I think what you're talking about is price cost changes. And in that, there are CPI data that shows when energy is pulled out. There are data that shows when medical costs are pulled out. But when you do and those will show up. So oftentimes people, and there's also one that actually pulls out housing costs. So this CPI, when it's reported, tends to be for all goods and services. It's a bundle of goods that not the Census Bureau, but BLS puts together. And in that one, you can find that, you can go to their site, BLS, and you can look at that. So I just want to give you that reference. But the GDP is an accounting of all goods and services produced. So it's all the services and all those other types of things. The GDP, you can break that down, as you also perhaps pointed out. You can break that down and look at sectors, and you can see energy sector. But the historic patterns have always been to include all goods and services. Yes, sir.
Yeah, could you go back to that slide where you had sunshine and you had something in the middle?
All the way.
Then it was cloudy or clouds or blue skies?
Yeah.
The weather. Okay, so given all of the information that we have received today, and you look at the strengths and the foundations of the risks, what I'm feeling from being in this room is that for folks who were born and raised here, we're going through an identity crisis. I don't know what we are no more. I was born and raised here. I'm 65 years old. Born and raised in the Five Points and former student here at DU back in the 70s in the business school. So the disconnect with all of this has got us in the stage of an identity crisis, where we are more like other places in the United States than what we are original, as if there's something wrong with us, and that we need to be fixed by the East Coast or the West Coast or the South or Canada or Europe or the moon, you know. It's like, I didn't know there was something wrong with me. See, I'm very proud to be from the Wild, Wild West, and we have a distinct flavor. And one of the things I'm proud about is I don't have to go and look at the mountains. I go up in the mountains when everybody else goes home from the tourist thing, so I can have some peace and enjoy the environment. So it looks like we have an identity crisis going on here, and we need to figure out a way in the future how we can get back to being proud of Colorado.
Sure. One more question.
So
Jeff, did you want to respond
thank
to
you.
that at all?
I don't know if there was a question.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I wanted to just ask about affordable housing and getting affordable housing built. So the council's committed to it, the mayor has said he's committed to it, and yet it seems like getting affordable housing done is challenging, having been involved in some projects where we are trying to, and it requires tax credits, it requires DURA, it requires OED, it requires going in a circle until you figure out how to do that. If we're gonna actually build units, what does the city need to do? What can we do to expedite the ability for developers of all kinds to start building affordable?
So, you raised a couple points. So first off, there's the cost issue. As you can imagine, and many people have expressed this already, land costs, housing costs, and other things have risen here significantly. Traditionally, the way you think about housing costs when you start going forward and building these, just so everyone understands, is you talk about what's called the cost per land per door. That has changed from somewhere around $10,000 to probably $25,000 per unit, and so per those doors. As you also pointed out, there's a marble cake of funding, and while Denver, through the council action and through the mayor's action, has raised put general fund in housing. When I was running the housing program for Denver during the prior to this administration, we did not have any general fund dollars, any city dollars going into housing. It was all federal dollars is how we're funding the gaps. Now, the most significant dollars that are probably going in, well, the significant dollars, at least from the city's perspective, are all general fund dollars. They're your general tax dollars that are starting to go into that. That had not happened until 4 years ago, I think, is when council first approved that first $15 million. So, first place is, used to be federal government paid or helped create a lot of affordable housing and we're financing it. Now it's primarily local governments that are doing that all across the country. And so that's changed it. And as you're also pointing out, it takes low-income housing tax credits from CHAFA. It takes the state of Colorado putting money in that actually came from the tobacco settlement. And other things all coming together, and now the marijuana industry, we're supportive of it, and so the 2% additional tax on the marijuana industry is going toward affordable housing. So there's a lot of complication here. The other part of it, quite frankly, in talking to the nonprofits, who are the primary people that are building lien restricted or deed restricted housing, as well as some for-profits, because they're out there too doing it, is what they say is the biggest issue we have is finding available land and being able to secure it at a reasonable price. And so I'm going all the way back to that land price issue. But the reality is that's the biggest challenge they're finding. It's not even necessarily the financing as a whole. So what we collectively have to do, so an example that came from the East Coast, I think sometimes it's important to learn from other cities and figure out what works for us, is there are places where churches, as an example, are saying, hey, I've got this parcel of land, I don't need this that's next to it, I've had that forever, and we're never going to develop whatever it was we thought we were going to do it. And so they're saying we're going to allow housing to go there, and affordable housing. We're looking to see, the council's asked the mayor to identify any vacant land in the city that can be built. So the reality is one of the greatest things we have to do in order, the first step in this is to figure out where the land is, where we can build it, where it can be complementary. So that doesn't mean taking something that's being used for something else. It means finding those vacant places and figuring out where that is that complements the neighborhoods. So we can have a much longer conversation. You can imagine I've spent a fair amount of time thinking about all these things, and I'm happy to engage in conversations, but I think we do want to move on to other things. I'm not trying to cut anybody short. I'm happy to talk to you in breaks or whatever. So, Councilman?
Thank you. Jeff Herman. And we will have a moment or two to speak with all of our presenters, as I said, towards the end. A couple of thoughts that had come to my mind before we get into the next spinner session, not related to anything in particular that I've heard, but just thoughts that have been in my mind, is just to add just another kind of an underline to the fact that with our economy doing so well, and unemployment being so low, it's not doing so well for everybody. There's large portions of our population that are not sharing in these wonderful times in Denver. The other thing is just, talking about the diversity of our city. My district, District 6, and I'm going back to the last census statistics I had, I described District 6 as the third most monochromatic district in the city. We're somewhere at that point, somewhere about mid 80% white, I believe about 11% African American, and about 9% Latino. However, we have Place Bridge Academy, which has 830 of their 1,000 students speak 70 different languages. We have Merrill Middle School, about 350 international kids. We have about 700 at South High School as part of their international program. We have about 1,400 international students at the University of Denver. So when the school bell rings in District 6, the statistics change a great deal. The problem with this is that those numbers are beginning to change. Again, because of the housing costs in Denver, we're beginning to see our refugee population moving to Aurora and other more affordable places. So with that said, I think it's time to move into our next spinner session. So if you will do as you did last time, spin your dial. If it lands on the same thing you had, why don't you find another one, and we'll check back in with you in about 10 minutes. Thank you.
I have a quick housekeeping note. We're not taking any breaks, so move around as you like. The restrooms are...
I just watched the 9-part free video series on genetically modified organisms and the use of glyphosate in the United States and the world. And to me, one of the things other than housing that we should be doing is banning glyphosate or banning Roundup and associated products, because what this 9 series program says, and it's GMOs Revealed, GMOS Revealed. It's free. You sign up with your first name and your email address, and every day they send you, for 9 days, they send you a 2-hour video to watch with different experts having conversations. And what they tell us is that so much Roundup and associated products with glyphosate in them have been used in the United States that it's in our water, it's in our bloodstream, it's in our soils, it evaporates and goes into the air, and we are saturated with glyphosate, which is having serious problems on human health. It's killing the microbiome in the soils and in our bodies. And so if we want to move towards a better future for sustainable living, one step we could take is banning the use of glyphosate in Denver.
I think encouraging also community gardens and making sure, like, as we develop spaces, right, making sure that people have access to grow their own food in some capacity.
One of the speakers in that series points out that towards the end of World War II, we were growing 45% of our food in the Victory Gardens. So that can be done. We can do it. 45% of our food was local, organic, and grown in our own property.
And if you don't have, because I think that's part of the thing that we're going to be looking at with Denver and continued growth, is fewer people will have yards, right? So really making sure that we have got like rooftop gardens or access to
Balcony
and designated community lots, things like that, so that people have access to some patch of ground upon which they can grow their own organic food.
But we can do it.
We can.
We can do it.
We absolutely can.
I wanted to address sustainability. Somebody mentioned it.
So that they
I'm sure if we do the Gross Dam expansion, that most of that water will benefit us. I'm sure we'll have some of that. I think that's going to help a lot.
As long as we have support.
Is it video? Yeah, it's a good point. Climate change. The library recommends drives everything.
Should we do anything?
You stick your tongue out.
Resources we have are limited.
Yeah, and that's the basic question they started out with. Do we want to grow to 900,000 or more? That's a major issue. Maybe it's the bigger we get.
And our infrastructure, that's a resource that's limited. Our capacity to educate, unless we're going to infuse the city with more schools and more teachers.
Yeah, I'm trying to become a permanent teacher. I'm a substitute teacher.
Me too.
Okay. Are you a substitute?
I am.
Great.
You guys work at Denver Public School?
I do. I'm in Denver.
You can
No,
spin the wheel.
I do high school and middle school, English, social studies, and math. Not sure what the further
Well,
graphic
that
is.
actually, education goes to sustainability. If we can't afford, we don't pay our teachers well enough, they can't live here. They can't afford to live here. They'll move out to other places, and then how are we educating our kids at a great level?
There's such a backlash against tax increases and more spending. It seems like, although Denver seems to get all at once, and then the state right, it doesn't. So, because we have Denver right, we have the bonds, we now have all the things that passed in Denver this time. So, but yeah, it's a good point. If statewide we're not able to support taxes and spending, how are we going to, get it, sustain our growth?
Yeah, and people complain when you add the bike lane that like it slowed down so much. It was 12 seconds, and like from downtown to I-25 was added, which is like totally worth giving people like some room to bike around it. And like especially if you're still going 7 miles per hour faster than the speed limit, it's probably fine. Like
design our streets
yeah,
to be safer, right?
yeah. And I think, like, I don't know, at first I hated the scooters. I really did. I don't know why. I was really averse to the change. And then I'm like, wow, this is really cool. Like, you can store 25 scooters in the space of one car. Like, imagine how many more people you can bring to each neighborhood if instead of one parked car at a meter, you have a scooter parking and it's 20. Or bikes, which is 10. Like what a vibrant, dynamic city, and instead of the streets being about storing my personal vehicles, it's a really shared public space that we can all protect. Chaos. We need more chaos on the road.
I have a radical idea.
Okay.
And it's so the last mile problem. You guys know what that is, right? Like light rail's great, but if the light rail is a mile and a half away, and you got to drive and park there, and there's no parking, not so great anymore. You're not going to do it. That's my issue. I just don't go. I just drive. So the last mile issue is, I define it as get that stuff closer to where people are. So why not put a streetcar, light rail, I don't know, up and down Lincoln, Colfax, or not Lincoln, Broadway and Colfax.
Just check out the blueprint.
And that's what I mean. I'm not on top of it. I've heard of it, but to me, that would be amazing.
Yeah.
And Spear, maybe.
Take a look at Denver Moves Transit.
Yeah.
They lay out we have a whole bunch of ideas about local transit, including the frequency of transit all over the city, but also where we'd have capital investment corridors that would increase the availability of high capacity, like BRT, maybe not streetcar everywhere, and that would include Colfax, Federal, Colorado, Spear, Leedsdale, all those big corridors.
Does that have legs?
Yeah, lots of legs.
Yeah. We're going to do 2 sentences, or maybe 1.5 sentences. So just let's go ahead, and who wants to start? Perfect. Rachel.
All right, so we got utopia this time. We flipped it from dystopia, and I'm just going to shout some keywords, which was basically responsible density, like mixed use.
Could you speak up a little bit?
Yes, yes, I will.
Okay, thank
so
you.
some keywords for utopia and what's in the future is responsible mixed-use development. You know, making sure. I'm sorry.
Missing middle.
Right, we're having this missing middle that we need to fix. Having affordable housing for especially younger people, making sure that they can actually live here in the city. And what were some of the other things? Community, right? Yeah. So Utopia Denver still has that sense of community. You know, less rentals, more people who can own homes, build their neighborhoods, keep them beautiful, keep them vibrant, and keep them close knit. Transportation, of course, being another one. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
That's my sentence.
Thank you. That's a great one. All right, Lisa, go ahead and pick the next one.
Okay, can you hear me? Cool. All right, we had a very spirited 10 minutes over here. I think a big topic for us was campaign finance and looking at that. Oh, sorry, we had ethics when we spun. Campaign finance and specific issue contributions, because there's a big concern and interest at our table to focus more as a city on what we want to do and not where the money is driving activity. And also a lot of interest in a phrase that one of our table mates mentioned, which was, who are we responsible to as citizens, as leaders, as community members and neighbors, and how can we act ethically in the city by thinking about things that way?
Great, thanks. Yep. Lisa has the mic here, so she has the power.
We had dystopia. I think the two key things were basically diversity, where our neighborhoods are not integrated in this whole dysfunction of millennials integrating into neighborhoods but displacing people. And I guess maybe secondly is how we define affordable housing. If somebody's making $16 an hour, $32,000 a year, and they have to pay 50% of that towards housing, that's a huge dysfunction in terms of affordability.
Thank you.
Our table had this time sustainability, and we talked about sustainability on a number of different levels. I think sustainability based on environment, sustainability based on urban environment, and then quality of life decrease was really kind of like probably the core of what we were after. It's like if our environment is degraded, then our quality of life would be degraded.
We had a great discussion about the impacts of some of what's happening in Denver on our future and our desired future. A couple of creative ideas came up. We talked about land trusts as a way to approach the housing affordability and density issues. We recognize that in a lot of cities of our scale, that the density doesn't need to just happen vertically. It can happen on small lots. Condos can be built above a freestanding garage. For example, I mean, adding density can happen in a number of different ways. And then the financial impacts, looking at bonding and how that's done, and the desire to maybe have more opportunities for Denver to the public here to participate in opportunity bonds that might be an idea.
Great.
Yes, our table spun to sustainability, and there's one thing we talked about that I'll save for questions for the panel, because I was going to ask the same question to our economists, but we talked about several other things that I'll mention here in my brief time. We talked about, in terms of housing, because that question is going to be related to the price of housing being so high, but one thing that I did want to mention now that we talked about on that was we've talked about the investment in affordable housing, but the concern is a lot of what we don't like about the growth in Denver right now probably is it seems like every square inch of vacant land you're seeing already being developed into all of this high density, over expensive housing. So what's the answer to provide affordable housing apparently? Well, let's find whatever more vacant little piece of land there is and build that. Whether it's affordable or not, we're not going to have any vacant land left is one issue that I don't know how to solve it, but that was one of our concerns for sustainability of quality of life. And then also environmental issues. Is there going to be enough water for 900,000 people, more than 900,000 people? I mentioned the Gross Dam project. That's going to increase that reservoir. We've talked about losing our trees and our distinction in Denver versus the suburbs of having older trees and mature trees if we just do too much development at the expense of our environment and our trees.
Great. Lisa, let's move over to this other side. We have like 2 minutes.
Two sentences, one
Okay.
sentence. We landed on policy, and I think one of the most interesting things that we talked about was transportation, and looking at redefining how we look at our roads and the protection that people have with this.
Great, thank you.
At least you didn't grab the mic.
Thank you. We had ethics over here, and we talked about it in relation primarily to development and creating somewhat of a code of ethics that developers have to follow to represent neighborhood context, historical context, so that we can't just build whatever we think should be built based on customer or community desires. And then we also talked about involvement of the community, so how do you somewhat require or to some extent encourage more community involvement by all generations so that the ethics that we all think are appropriate for a better city are represented of all ages.
Thank you. One more. Right up in the front, Kirsten.
So we talked about ethics as well, and we wanted to define it first, and we fell on how do we keep things human-centered versus dollar-centered, and then that went into a conversation about the demise of our ethical institutions, i.e. churches, and so as those less and less people are going to places like church, how are we creating new centered spaces in our communities for people to come face to face and have in-person conversations with their neighbors so they're not fearful of the people that live next door to them, but they're actually getting to know them as individuals and really kind of keep that lens of do unto others at the forefront of our communities.
Thank you. To shed for a second a little bit of light on what the heck are we doing? Okay, why did we choose a poet to kick us off today, and why the Spinners? We have 13 members on Denver City Council. I figure within the thousands of people in our city government, we have a few hundred people in real decision-making places. We have, as we've seen on the screen, over 700,000 people in the city and county of Denver. We have some very challenging issues to face as a city. And the chances are we're going to get as many, if not more, answers from those 700,000 people that don't work at City Hall as we are from those of us who do. So we're not expecting to walk out of here with particular answers, but to just start the dialogue gurgling up a little bit more vibrantly and hope that you will all continue to be involved. Next, I mentioned early on a video that Los Angeles commissioned. Its title is Capacity, and talks about Los Angeles trying to get a handle on how they'll, what their maximum population is. So it's about 8 minutes long, so we're going to show that to you right now, after which I'll introduce you to our next speaker. Well, so obviously a very thought-provoking presentation. Lisa has been working with Gensler Group or Gensler Corporation, and some students, I believe, from the Auraria campus, at trying to put together a similar video based on Denver specifically. We couldn't get it ready for this event, but we hope to have that done in the near future. So the next thing we're going to move into, if I can grab my notes, and we will have time for more questions. Let's see here. Mr. Pirro.
Yes, sir.
Our final presenter for the day is Dr. Rocky Pirro. All these doctors in the room are making my BA in sociology seem awfully small. Rocky served as Denver's Director of Planning and Development for about 18 months in 2013 and early 2014. He serves on the board for the International Environment and Urban Planning Association. He's past chair of the Regional and Intergovernmental Planning Division of the American Planning Association, and is currently Executive Director of the Colorado Center for Sustainable Urbanism, and has presented his ideas at conferences across America and around the world. Please welcome Dr. Rocky Pirro.
So, thank you. I love capacity analysis. We'll talk about it a little bit here this morning. So thank you so much. It's a delight. I appreciate Councilmember Cashman inviting me to be with you today. A few folks have talked a little bit more about their background beyond the introduction. So all four of my grandparents immigrated to Colorado. I've never figured out whether I can consider them first generation or if it's my parents' generation, that's actually the first generation. Their caravans were all ships from Europe. So right through Ellis Island. So yes. Let me get our little clicker gizmo here. So let's see. Yeah, that's where we want to be here. No, that's where we want to be. So I've been asked to work with you this morning a little bit about trends and tools around planning for cities and planning for urban regions here. I'm going to just give you some quick teasers on some of the trends. Andy and Jeff have done a good job talking about a lot of the trends here in Denver. Mine will maybe talk a little bit about comparisons with other regions around the country here. But I really want to focus on a couple of tools that really relate to some of the capacity analysis work that we saw here with the LA video here. I am, though, going to start with a shameless commercial. I don't know if I can promote CU Denver while I'm here at DU, but yeah, I see some people rooting here. So the Colorado Center for Sustainable Urbanism is about 5 years old. And I mean, we set this up to really be an agent of change and to get into pioneering 21st century solutions that we felt were not happening in the city, in the region, and in the state here. So our center really serves as a hub, not just for academics and students, but for professionals, practitioners, citizen groups, elected officials, and we really work on a variety of issues where we can lift up best practices and tools around sustainability here. I do want to talk, I'm very proud of one of our initiatives here. It touches on what one of the gentlemen who introduced himself mentioned about displacement. So I want to get to that in a minute, but it's the Colorado Healthy Places Collaborative that we've set up. We just launched this earlier this year. It now includes 24 statewide associations. And what we're doing is really trying to blow the lid off of traditional understanding of health in a community. So it isn't just about disease prevention. It isn't just about active living and recreating, but all aspects of living in a city. The natural environment, where we've harmed it, where it needs healing for us to be healthy and not exposed to toxins and contaminants. How we deal with air pollution, climate, how we deal with how we site homes, how buildings are built. Do people have access to sunshine? The mountain views we talked about, air quality. What do we need to do around resilient economy and that relationship to health, education and health, as well as issues around mobility and full access for all people. So we're working on that with 24 different partner organizations that have never worked together before on the issue of displacement, whether that's because of gentrification or large mega projects like the I-70 super widening going on in North Denver. I mean, what we have seen in terms of health impacts on people who are displaced, physical, mental, emotional impacts. We just did a symposium on this in April. It was very sobering, and to see that they're multi-generational. It's not just the immediate people who get displaced, but the impacts that it has on their children and other generations, losing community, losing that connectivity, and so on. So a lot of work we're doing there, and again, I'm happy to talk about any of this. Just to talk about some trends around planning, I want to lift up that urban planning, regional planning here, is something that continues to evolve. It's not a static thing. We continue to see different issues and concerns come into play, and I'm one who advocates that you do an integrated holistic systems approach and bring all of these issues together. You don't address these things in silos. You just don't address a trend at a time, but you work everything into play in terms of the interrelationships here. So as you see on this slide, the last couple of decades we've been getting more into issues around sustainability, climate change, resiliency, how we deal with hazards, whether they're natural or human cause, and issues now, for example, of planning for food. I mean, how rich that is in terms of bringing that and other issues around health into play in our planning dynamics. So we see comprehensive planning, for example, becoming much more sophisticated, much more multidimensional. Unfortunately, I feel like when I first entered the planning profession, we kind of worked in silos. Things were very one-dimensional. I mean, the land use planners did their things. The mobility planners, transportation planners did their thing. The housing planners did their thing. And I mean, we didn't always connect the dots. I mean, that's an embarrassment. I think we're beyond that now and really looking at how to talk about stuff in a much more holistic and integrated manner. I mean, we're seeing regional transportation plans now addressing issues around housing, climate, economic development, environmental restoration, and that's very rich. So again, you've heard me use the term systems planning, and I love that we see our discipline now working more with ecosystems, economic systems, housing for all, I heard mentioned earlier today, mobility for all, and so on. So here are a number of initiatives or principles that are being advanced throughout the United States through our professional association, the American Planning Association. Again, look at just kind of the richness of of where we are now. I mean, talking about harmony with nature, resilient economy. I mean, ensuring that everyone has the economic means to tend to their well-being, to their housing needs, their mobility needs, services, and so on here. Healthy communities, I've mentioned already. Responsible, real regionalism, working with our neighborhoods, seeing cities, suburban cities not as competitors, but I mean neighbors among neighbors here. Authentic citizen engagement. You have people at the get-go of a process, before you start a process, they're involved in pre-planning, scoping out what issues you're doing, involved in every step and phase of the work, and then part of adoption and taking actions and implementation to their fulfillment here, I mean accountable implementation that you see here. Quickly, emerging trends with regional planning. This is actually a book I co-edited with a colleague a year ago here. And I want to walk through these very quickly with you and then get to the tools around capacity analysis. So we are seeing, again, all across the country, planning in that very complex interjurisdictional, intergovernmental maze that you have in metropolitan regions. So for example, here in the Denver region, we have 9 counties, more than 60 cities, but coming together in terms of working on issues of sustainability. These are not either or things. I mean, this is something we still are challenged with a lot of decision makers. Well, if we have something in front of us that's good for the economy, but may have some impacts on the environment, let's just work with those trade-offs. It's no, you work with making decisions where there's benefits, benefits, benefits. There's economic benefits, there's environmental benefits, and there's benefits to people, different social sectors around equity. I mean, that's the sustainability model. Again, I don't need to spend a lot of time on this, but we are seeing a more sophisticated treatment of integrated planning going on with all sorts of issues, all sorts of concepts and systems around integration here. And I'd like to really lift up the urban-rural interface here. I think a lot of urban regions around the U.S. for decades just saw the beyond the last subdivision as just being open for continued urbanization and expansion. So they were just kind of holding areas. We are learning and valuing, or giving value to our rural areas. They are important, they serve a role, their character, their communities, their economic contributions are important, and so you need to keep that in balance and ensure that there's vibrant activity and ways of life in the rural areas as well. Much more is happening with engagement in regional planning. That used to be kind of a hidden part of planning, that just people who came and sat at the regional table, whether they were staff or a selected group of elected officials, worked on. So there's a lot more going on, reaching out into the communities with citizen groups, with different interest groups, different other agencies and organizations to really help develop integrated regional collaborative solutions here. So a lot is happening with new technologies and so on, that, and also new partnerships here. So for example, when I worked in Seattle, there was an interest to develop a regional open space strategy. We didn't really have the resources in local government or regional government to do it. The university stepped in, foundations stepped in, volunteers stepped in, and created something that was a very unique and new way to look at open space connectivity that took habitat into consideration, migrations of species, as well as opportunities for recreation and enjoyment of open space activities by the population there. Demographic changes. Jeff touched on this a little bit. I like to work with this concept called the 4 S's. So where we're seeing increases in demographics, demographic groups, and collectively these 4 groups within the next 10 years will actually be the dominant part of the home market, not the 2 adults, 2 kids model that we have seen historically, but we see growing numbers of seniors. This is true in most metro areas. It's true here in the Denver area as well. A growing demand for single-person households, people living in a home unit or a housing unit by themselves. Startups, the new people entering the housing market that Jeff talked about, and a very interesting increase in the number of single-parent households that we're seeing. So again, is our housing market really being responsive to these changes we're seeing in demographics, the needs and demands that are coming online here? And then finally, some new tools. A lot of what we're doing now with ways of modeling and looking at different scenarios for the future make it so easy for people to just sit at the table and look at different ways that growth, that density, impact issues, many of them that you've talked about here. So if you densify in a certain way, what are the implications on services? What's the implication on mobility? What's the implication on climate? What's the implication on parking? So I mean, these are real tools now that you can sit down and work with. Thank you. And so let's get into our tools here. So one is what's called buildable lands analysis. And this is used a lot in Washington State and Oregon, other parts of the country. What this does is it's a process where you look at where you have existing vacant land or underutilized land. And that is the focus and the emphasis before you look at rezoning or changing zoning in other areas or districts. So we use this very successfully in Seattle. On the regional scale, we saw that with what was vacant and underutilized land, we didn't need to extend urban growth boundaries. We didn't need to annex any additional land. As a matter of fact, we had 6 master plan communities or fully contained communities that were planned out on the edge that we were able to take out of consideration and say, we don't need those. We've got plenty of capacity for future development in areas that are already parts of cities and receiving urban services. So that's one tool I wanted to introduce you to here. So again, it really helps you assess the whole role of vacant land. There's actually some pretty sophisticated steps that you don't just look at vacant land and assume it's developable. I mean, you really assess the quality of the land, its access to essential public facilities, infrastructure, to then calculate how can that land be brought in for development, again, before you look at existing developed areas. Here's some examples. This PowerPoint will be available through the council member's office, so you can look at that. The final tool I want to talk to you about does get at this adequacy issue, these capacity issues. So it's called concurrency. 2 states have fairly sophisticated models of this, Florida and Washington State. So what it is it's a process that ensures that you have adequate facilities at the time of development or within a reasonable time of the development coming online. So in Washington State's situation, you have to show that you have the money to provide the infrastructure to support the development, and that'll be online within 6 years of the development opening up here. Florida's model is more tied to the actual point in time of development actually opening up and coming online. So, and local jurisdictions in Washington State, we're showing this one right now, I mean, really have to have a reassessment strategy in place here when they run into that. If the development project cannot demonstrate adequate facilities, you have to, again, demonstrate how that's going to happen, where the money's going to come from, or you can deny the development, okay? Part of that reassessment strategy could be to review some of the provisions around what adequacy means, but by and large it's simply accepting that what we saw, for example, in the LA video, I mean, if you can provide water, fine. If you're exceeding our capacity with a particular development, then again, that development has to be questioned. Most of the time in Washington State where jurisdictions ended up having to take action against development was around transportation, interestingly enough. That if a certain development was going to show that it was going to lead to congestion, over stress facilities, then again, there had to be a commitment to make investments to correct some of that. In Florida, I just wanted to show quickly here, their concurrency program addresses sanitary sewer, solid waste, drainage, potable water, parks and recreations, and schools. Again, you have to demonstrate that development will continue to have those facilities at an adequate level and not stress them out. I mean, parallel to many of the issues we saw in the LA video. So that's my presentation, and turn it back over to the council member. Thank you.
So we've got about 15 or 20 minutes left. We'll open it up to questions for any of our presenters. Ann?
I really like the LA thing, and I like Dr. Perry. There are a couple of things I'd like to see added. The most, glaringly obvious thing that was missing from the LA is air quality. Because that place is starting to look like Hong Kong. So air quality's got to be a part of that. It probably should be a part of it here, because here we're talking about PM 2.5. I mean, because of all the traffic we have in this city, the air we're all breathing is giving us all ischemic heart disease. So air quality really ought to be a part of it here. The second thing that I think ought to be involved in all these sustainable arguments is livability. I can remember when we could sit in our front yard and never hear a thing after 6 o'clock. Now it's about 12:30 in the morning. And so to me, that means the livability standards of Denver have fallen into the 12. And I think that truly ought to be a discussion this town has. And I think that's probably one of the reasons people are leaving. You don't enjoy it here anymore.
Thank you. Rocky?
Just some quick responses to that. My numbers may be a little out of date here, but in 2017, Denver was ranked 11th by the American Lung Association in terms of air pollution. I mean, we're almost in a top 10. I don't think that's a top 10 we want to be part of, okay? Statewide, Colorado now ranks 8th in ozone. And again, that's a statistic that may be a year or two old. But I remember, again, having grown up here, in the 80s, we were very proud. We tried to address air quality. I mean, it had economic impacts. People were moving away. It was an issue. We had a tainted reputation. We're creeping back in. I don't know if we're creeping. I think we're going quickly back into very poor air quality. And I don't hear it as part of the public discussion.
Thank you, sir. Sir? Hey guys, if you can use the mic.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. So this is also for you, Dr. Pyro. Can you talk a little bit about what it takes to integrate this concurrency into planning on a local, regional level? And I'm really headed toward what would it take for Denver to do that sort of thing at this point?
Yeah, thank you. So the question would be, how would we bring concurrency into a decision-making process here in Denver? The examples I gave you were 2 states where the legislature took action and required that municipalities develop their own ordinances around it. In Washington State's situation, each locality was free to design its own program. They had to do something, but it wasn't prescribed exactly what form it took. Florida, there is a little bit more of a top-down approach with it here. In Colorado, even though we don't have state legislation requiring it, the way planning legislation is written here, we're enabled to do it. So if our citizenry, our elected officials had the will to say, we want concurrency to be incorporated into decision-making, that could happen by an action of the City Council.
Okay. Paul?
I was wondering, this is a question for Jeff, the economist. I was wondering if you had heard this fact that I heard on Colorado Public Radio News couple months ago, that if you compare just housing costs and income levels on a county basis throughout the United States, the most expensive county to live is City and County of Denver in the whole nation, they said. Number 2 was City and County of Broomfield, and number 5 was Jefferson County. Does that make sense to you? Do you think that's probably true? I thought that's what I heard them say. And if it were to be true, wouldn't that mean that we have an automatic barrier coming up? Because if that continues, you'd think housing prices would have to come down, or incomes would have to go up, and probably housing prices will come down first. What do you make of those statistics?
A number of questions, and so I think this one's on. So let me try to answer them individually. And I think it was Annie Lamont that said, I heard it on NPR, so it must be true. Therefore, I'm going to go with it. No, I'm just kidding. But they tend to be, the media is all over the place, but I've heard that type of thing. I don't know if it's number one, because I think of some other places that are incredibly expensive to live, and the wage levels within those communities tend to be pretty low. Even just to our north in Boulder, as an example, which has oftentimes been that typical. That all said, I think you're raising a more fundamental, whether we're number 1 or number 10, it doesn't matter. I think the issue that you're talking about is the disconnect between the housing market and the labor market. First place is labor markets, whether on a localized level or national level, they tend not to be the geography of a city. So in this particular case, as you all know, many people work outside Denver that live in Denver, and vice versa. There's roughly, and this is what causes congestion, as you all know, there's about 200,000 people every day that's coming into Denver to work. And so when we talk about sustainability, and we talk about concurrency planning and things like that, or when we talk about this topic of housing, recognize you're in an ecosystem, in an economic system that is not unique to the border. So people do cross Hampden Avenue and come here every day. That said, the market works that way too from a labor market. And the other part of it that's always weird, and everybody assumes perfect clearing markets and equilibrium, housing markets do not work that way, which is why you see some differences in those graphs I showed you earlier. What we're seeing over the last year to 2 years now, we're finally seeing wage levels starting to rise at a higher rate than they have been for a long period of time. That said, they will not keep up with housing price change. So I'm not trying to paint away the issue. I'm just telling you that markets move differently, and we may see some housing price compression occur, as we saw in 2008 or 2000 or 1990 when I moved here. So we see those markets move differently. That said, I think we've got to think about how housing is different. And there's been a movement here that, and across the country, especially in larger cities, where housing size is shrinking. And I don't know how a family of 2, 1, or 4 can live in a 400 square foot space. But that is really the new market that we kind of hear is the micro units. And so that's part of the solution that people are doing. We talked about ADUs, and the city is moving forward on ADUs and trying to encourage those more and more. So we're trying to do those things, but the reality is I think one of the key things that oftentimes planners talk about, to their credit, is think about the whole cost perspective, which is the housing transportation relationship. And I would argue here it's housing, energy, and transportation. Because we actually have some of the cheapest energy of any city in the country, and so that helps the household burden. Now, all of that said, again, I'm going to go back to the point you raised, which is, yes, I would bet, you asked what my feeling is. I don't know that particular study that you're talking about, but my feeling is yes, we're probably in the top 10, maybe top 25 at worst, but probably in the top 10, and that's something that I think we should all be concerned of, and I know that the elected officials of Denver are very concerned with that problem. And so it's about getting more ideas on how we can overcome that. So I hope I answered your question.
Spencer?
This is an economics question again. Have we looked at, or is the city considering positive incentives for alternative transportation? So like taking a family of 4 to the airport on the A line is hilariously prohibitive. So my question was about positive incentives for alternative transportation. So folks that move here, like myself, and don't own a car and bike everywhere, or people who try to take the light rail. Because if you were going to take a family of 4 on the A line to the airport, that at certain times can be twice as expensive as an Uber, which is much easier for people to take. And I don't know if we're exploring options like that.
And perhaps I can start a little bit, and maybe my colleagues may want to speak a little bit more to it. As many of you know, there was a Mile High Connects, which is an organization that operates with lots of support from a number of organizations, was leading a strong advocacy role to encourage RTD to adjust their rate fares and that, especially to affect how it affects low and moderate income families. So the RTD board, I believe, last month, I think it was, maybe it's 2 months ago, did make some fare changes to make it more affordable. It needs to do more. I think part of this is there is this dynamic within economics that suggests that as you introduce a new product or a new mode in this particular case, you get some unique pricing that's occurring. And so in Boulder, they do subsidize direct transit through their, I can't remember all the little bus loops, but they're doing that out of the general fund. Other cities have done that. It's something that I think council has looked at different times, and if I recall, I think right now we're subsidizing the new system that takes people from effectively downtown to Cherry Creek, that your colleagues, the Chariot. And so I think there's a lot of exploration on new ways to do it. I absolutely agree with you. I bike 80% of my time, and it's strange oftentimes when I show up and I'm on a bike at Cherry Creek. But people kind of appreciate it in the sense that, I think it gives you freedoms. And so we all talk about monetary issues. You're talking about costs. The reality is you also get some freedom from biking or using other modes. And so I think that's part of it, and we're trying to figure it out. Just as a reminder to everybody, and I don't know what it is today, but at least when I was doing some of the analysis on the Fast Track's proposal, fare box recovery for transit is about 35 cents. Is what it generally runs. That's kind of the metric that FTA uses. So right now, we collectively are subsidizing transit here, not at the local government level, but there is a special sales tax, as you know, both for the build out of Fast Tracks, but also for the operations. I think it's 4/10. So that's my quick answer.
Could you all, or one of you, take a broader look at this distinction in our society between an upper income, middle, and lower, because that disparity, as I mentioned before, is gross. So a millennial might jump out in a job at 60 to 80,000, and there's all kinds of variations of themes about what people make for annual salaries. And we don't like to talk about it very much, but the school teachers, sure, we got to talk about that. And then the good news about the plumber electrician can kind of start to make it. But now we have this, and that may be the final piece of this lower income piece at that $14, $15, $16 level, 16 times 2,000 again was 32,000, who aren't going to be able to make it. And I mean aren't going to be able to make it without putting grandma and aunts in basements. So can you speak about that whole overview of what we've done to our society, where these service jobs have to be available, and it's a double-edged sword where we're not paying enough, and we still have to have people doing lower level service jobs.
Yeah, let me start with that, but I know my colleagues will definitely want to jump in on this one. So you embedded there is probably 5 or 6 different constructs and issues. So just to give everybody a sense of this, if somebody were making $15 an hour in the city and county of Denver right now, and there were 2 people in that household both working, and they're working full time, that would give an income roughly of $63,000.
Minus tax.
Well, but I'm just telling you the gross income level, so $63,000. We use a metric in affordable housing that's talks about what's called area median income. The area median income for a 60% level, which is what we consider affordable housing, is $63,000. So that's kind of that equivalency that you talk about. We didn't talk about today, it was kind of referenced a couple times, but there's this concept that we've always believed in here, both in Colorado but more broadly, and that is that there should be this thing for economic opportunity and mobility. And I think you're getting at that a little bit. You're also talking about what is the sustainable wage levels and things like that. I've addressed a little bit of that, but One of the things is I was at a conference a couple of years ago, and I rarely ever go to conferences, so just because they're just kind of hard from my old days of academics. But the reality is I was sitting at this, and it was around economic mobility, and former chair Yellen was the coordinator of this conference, chair of the Federal Reserve Bank, and she said in her mind the most important economic issue for this generation, if not the next two, is economic mobility. And what you're referencing a little bit is that American dream. Do we still have it? Researcher after researcher said, and Nobel laureates and others, very much said that it still exists. However, the way that they paraphrased it, a gentleman by the name of Raj Chatty, and you may have heard of him because he just released some things with the Census Bureau that talked about that opportunity in all cities and all census tracts across America. What he said is it's the American dream, it still exists, but the rungs have gotten further apart.
Yeah.
And so when you think about that, and you think about some of the topics you've all been thinking about today and talking about, the reality is the challenges that we have before us, as was mentioned, and I can't remember who said it, is about creating opportunities for our children and other children to be able to live in the city that we've all called home now for some period of time. And so that ability is really where I think we need to be focusing a little bit in this conversation is what kind of opportunities are we creating, and are we building the city as we go forward that creates those same kinds of outcomes that we all enjoyed when we made the decision to either move here or stay here. Because somebody talked about seeing people leave, that's a choice. And the reality is I think what we want is people to still choose the city because it's a great place to be, and that choice is staying every day or moving here for the first time. And so I just throw that out as part of a beginning of an answer to your question. Since there's so many topics, I can't possibly answer them, so I'm going to let my colleagues talk to you.
So I'm going to take a little different approach with talking to your topic, and that is the tie-in back to housing. About 4 years ago, the Denver Regional Council of Governments completed a very impressive series of work pieces on the sustainable region. And one of them called for a regional housing plan. So we know a lot. I mean, you've heard a lot of our information today. So, I mean, we have data. We know things about housing. And we know a lot of it within Denver. Aurora has a fairly sophisticated program looking at its housing, where it has gaps, where it has oversupplies, and so on, based on income levels. What we're seeing missing is the kind of why. So why are we seeing certain phenomena in various cities? And we don't really have a total handle on policy guidance that we see among the 60 jurisdictions and so on. So we do know, just anecdotally, that it's somewhat lumpy. There are cities that have programs where they're trying to get housing in at all income levels, but other jurisdictions that are not. And so taking a regional look at it, looking at the needs regionally, and then beginning to have that dialogue, jurisdiction by jurisdiction, you know, what each jurisdiction can be doing to address this concern is vitally needed at this point in time.
Sure. One number I'd like to ask Jeff, or any of you that might have it, what is a sustainable income level in Denver right now? What do you need to be making to find yourself a place to live, etc.? I had heard somewhere in the $27 range a while back.
And I've spent some time looking at this. There's all kinds of different ways to measure that, and that's the unfortunate part. Is there's no single definition of what livable or sustainable or fair wages are, and so part of this is just thinking through that. The median household price here, the average household price in Denver now is just under $300,000. So if you work backwards from that, maybe that partially gets to your answer, and so therefore there's a number of assumptions you have to take. But if you work backwards from that, if you assume that people, in the old days it used to be 33% of your income, or of the price levels what your income should be, probably it's more like a quarter. It's really what we do now. But if we at 33%, that would make it $100,000 a year in order to own a home. in Denver currently. Not rental, I'm just talking about that, as a starting place to do some of these calculations. At that point, then you're really going to calculate it back to about $50 an hour. Now, once again, in most households in the modern American society, there's usually about 1.5 to 1.6 workers. What I mean by that is there's some that have one and some and a number that have two. So therefore, you'd probably be in that $35, $40 range. Would be that what it would take. That's probably a little bit high. There's some math that has to be done in it, but there's no right answer. There's no perfect, like, this is the number. But there's different ways to calculate it, and it'll depend upon a number of things. But I think that's a fair number,
Sure.
Councilman.
I remember, a year or two ago, we passed a state increase to our minimum wage to $12 an hour, but that's in increments. I think by 2020, you get to $12
It's
an hour.
$10.20 this year. It goes up to $11.10 on January 1st.
Right, and the airport workers are asking for a $15 minimum wage, and I believe it's the same thing in increments, so over a period of years. I don't know what $12 an hour, what good that does to anybody in 2020. I'm going to take one person over here, ma'am, and then I'll come back this way.
In the discussions today, there's been very little to nothing mentioned of the aging adults in our city and in our state. Now, the State Office of Demographics has projected the decade between 2010 and 2020, 155 people a day are turning 65 and older. By 2020, it's projected that 75% of head of households will be 65 and older. Also, the committee, the strategic panel on aging, their data has shown that a lot of the in-migration is 55 and older. So we're dealing with a whole lot of issues. Another issue that hasn't been addressed is the fact that there isn't adequate health care. My PCP in August of 2017 told me that in southeast Denver, 25 PCPs, primary care doctors, had either retired or gotten out of it. So any comments that you have on those issues would be great.
Well,
Yeah, it's on, just go.
okay. Hello? No, on top.
Hello, okay. Yeah, these are not really my main areas, but I will say, in terms of the aging, as our population does age, there are certain challenges that we're going to be facing in terms of our communities. Most notably, I think, in the mobility sector. We're still very heavily reliant upon driving. One of the things that really struck me from that Los Angeles video was that they looked at resources, but they didn't really consider how people were going to be able to move. If you're going to still have modal shares of somewhere on the order of 70% of people or higher driving, that's going to create some real issues in terms of just our overall level of mobility. And so when I think about aging, one of the things I think about mostly is in terms of mobility or lack of mobility. And so there needs to be a lot of new and creative solutions to dealing with that. Perhaps some of the ride sharing and transportation network companies can help in terms of providing that mobility gap so that you can get away from a situation where you have older people who are relying upon driving themselves, because that's going to become more of a challenge as we go forward. So I would say that looking at the whole range of potential solutions in terms of mobility is something that we really need to take a closer look at.
Rocky?
Yeah, huge issue, and again, the one graphic I showed that that's going to be a significant growing portion of the overall population and housing market. Quickly, the Denver Regional Council of Governments, so some of the work I've done on looking at what's happening with regional planning across the country needs to be lifted up, and I'll even go as far as say celebrated that this region has a program and a department devoted to aging that does look at issues related to seniors, housing, services, and so on. So we're fortunate to have that in place. Now, whether it's doing everything to meet the needs, particularly with some of the changes you talked about in terms of access to healthcare and so on, you know, we need to be looking at that and having a conversation. The other thing that's happening is that a lot of individual jurisdictions in many regions are advocating a notion of what's called universal housing. I don't want to go into all of it, but an aspect of it allows you to age in place so that your home is a place where it serves you throughout various stages and phases of life, including as you go into your senior years. And then finally, Jeff talked briefly about the ADU program that we have in the city, accessory dwelling units. There are many advocates of that who said that, again, is a program that provides benefits for people already in homes, including seniors, to allow for additional income to come into play to help them in their senior years.
Thank you. We're well over time already. I'm going to take 3 more questions and shoot you out of here. John?
So there was a report that came out a couple weeks ago from the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It said that we have to work hard to try and keep our temperature increase under 1.5 degrees centigrade. It's fairly, they recommended steps to take to do that. It's fairly clear we're not going to do that. It's going to get really warm here in Denver. What do you think of the impact on our planning for Denver?
We need to do more, and this is Rocky talking now with it. It's lovely that we have state acknowledgement of climate and work on strategies going on at that level. We do have a climate action plan here in the city, but I mean, we need serious commitments to real action around mitigating what our contributions are to greenhouse gas emissions, getting those reduced, and to be dealing seriously, adapting to what we anticipate are the changes here. So I think we've got a lot of work to do, and it needs to ramp up. So
yeah, I'll just add a little bit to that as well. We're making some progress in some sectors, slow but sure in terms of electricity generation and shifting to more renewable fuels. In industrial processes as well, I think there's some real progress that's being made there. An area where we tend not to be making as much progress is in transportation, and that tends to now be the largest sector in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And one part of that especially, and this is something that I've been looking at recently, is the growth in freight transportation and the contribution of greenhouse gas emissions from freight. That's a sector that doesn't get a lot of attention, but our cities rely upon it in terms of delivery vehicles, especially as we're shifting in terms of our retail towards online shopping and delivery vehicles. That's becoming a much bigger segment in terms of our transportation needs and impacts as far as greenhouse gas emissions. There's still not a lot going on in terms of shifting freight over to more renewable fuels. So that's an area that needs more attention going forward.
Thank you. One over here in the back, Susan.
I'm just wondering if any of you either were involved, wondering if any of you were involved in or have any comments on the widening of I-70, the whole project there, and the impacts on community and pollution and all of that.
You wanted to save that when we've got about 30 seconds, huh?
Well, I just really want to know if, were any of you involved in the planning on that?
yes, and I mean, I can talk to you. I mean, it's one reason I'm not with the city anymore, to be honest. I'll just share quickly with you. I grew up 4 houses from where they built I-70. So, I mean, I know, my family knows, my extended family knows what impacts there are having something like that introduced into a neighborhood. And I'll just quickly say I'd love to talk with you offline some more. I mean, it's just wrong. I mean, it's just wrong what's happening. Iliff University, which is part of the DU system here, in their letter with 400 faith leaders, almost 400 faith leaders, called the project unethical and immoral. We had means in my family where we were able to do new windows, insulation, put in our own air filtration system. And I mean, we lasted maybe about 10 more years and just gave up and had to move out of the neighborhood. My mom still laments that. She loved her home, she loved her neighborhood, and so on. So, yeah, there are much better solutions that we could have been pursuing, and this is very unfortunate.
Just one quick comment. I believe that our new governor-elect has said he was going to take another look at the I-70 project. So
I've met with him on that, so.
Have you? Yeah. Well, there's an opportunity to do something, maybe.
Maybe.
Okay. And that is a very long subject. Thank you for bringing that up. I'm glad it was mentioned. Last take, David?
Just a last one, more of a comment, is I think when we look at back to this income deal, we have a disruption in our family systems when we have to get two incomes to afford all this. So the 32 plus the 32 at 64 doesn't hold, because we all know how much child care costs. And then we have communities that don't even pay for full-time kindergarten. So what are we doing? We've got a long way to go in that. And then my last piece is, as a wannabe sociologist, we've got to introduce this concept of homeless. And homeless is not just the guy on the street with the sign. It comes in many categories. I'm not going to go much further, but we've got to look at family systems, people running at two people in a household working, and the disruption of how children are raised, where they become latchkey kids and a problem in society.
So just to kind of not comment, but add on to that comment, a gentleman by the name of Robert, since I'm in an academic setting, a gentleman by the name of Robert Putman, who teaches at Harvard, wrote a book a number of years ago called Bowling Alone, which talked about the loss of social institutions like churches and other things. And it became a very famous book, and I think he wrote it in the 90s. 2 years ago or 3 years ago at that same conference I was talking about where Chair Yellen was Robert Putman. He published a book around 3 years ago, maybe it's 2 years ago also, and his book is called Kids. And so if you want to think a little bit more about that concept, I would recommend reading that, because that's, again, builds around the second ability. One of the things that he said that was very interesting, and when you kind of to put it in true terms, is think about the number of hours that a moderate income family is able to read to their child each night while they're going through that formative stage. Think about the number of hours that a middle to upper middle income family may read to their children. And then transpose upon that, when they start school, think about the vocabulary that they have heard over that period of time, and therefore their ability to be successful in school going forward. So I'm not here to, this is an economist, here this is coming from an economic perspective. And so when you think about that, and then going even and adding into the homeless issue of it, both APS and DPS, one of the most troubling groups of students that they have to deal with, and I don't mean troubling in the sense of problem children, I mean in the sense of trying to get them to maturate and move on and achieve educational attainment, or often comes from the moderately housed population. And there are many cases in APS and DPS where students will be in the same school, the same grade at 4 schools in a given year. How do you succeed in that? So as a parent, as a member of society, and as an economist, I'm telling you, your point, sir, is a very good one, that we have to think through how we're going to do this, because you can't expect people to pull themselves up when they haven't had the ability to start. So I'm not trying to, I just want to build on yours, that I would suggest if you're interested in that topic, you might want to read a book called Kids by Robert Putman.
Thank you. I want to, if you give me one more minute, I want to thank all of you for wonderful questions, a great discussion. As I said, we didn't expect to walk out with the answer to the problem, but I'm hearing questions. Of all that I've heard spoken about today, I didn't hear one person concerned with making Denver a, quote, great city. I heard a lot of comments about what we need to do to keep Denver a great place to live, so I thank you for that. I want to thank, I want to thank Lisa and Brian and their volunteers for putting together a great event. I want to thank Susie Q. Smith,
Yes.
Professor Andy Dent, Jeff Romine, and Dr. Rocky Kira. And if you have a few minutes, take a walk around campus. It's a beautiful place to be. Pardon? As far as what's next, I've been asked what's next. We'll be thinking about all the input that we received today. We will be having some form of additional dialogue. We have your emails from when you RSVP'd. We'll be in touch soon.
Shining on my heart.